Hello and welcome to the Business of Storytelling from Moore's Law Media in association with Vimeo, the platform with everything you need to make, manage and share brilliant videos at vimeo.com. My name is Neil Moore. My job here is to meet and talk to brilliant storytellers, content creators and commissioners of content to find out what are they doing so well, how are they doing it, and how can we learn from them to do it better ourselves. And to that end, I'm joined today by Nadia Abdullah, who runs editorial and content for Visa, who you might have heard of. Biggest payment network in the world, possibly?
Possibly.
We've all got the logo in our wallets anyway.
Yes.
Thank you for joining me.
You're
The first question is, you have a pretty cool job. How did you get to that job? What were the key sort of milestones along the way?
My background is in media, so I was part of a regional publisher before this, or they like to think of themselves as global. And it was always in the business of, I was always on the commercial side of the publisher. I think I was just in the right space at the right time where brands were realizing that they have to move away from just doing ads and started looking at what they call content. So, the publishers that I was a part of, they woke up and realized that they needed to do or create this content for their partners in-house because cost. And because when you do content, there's a brand, the publisher's brand gets, to be a part of that content. So I was in the brand studio world of, these publishers for a while. And it was fun. I really enjoyed it. I think it was a great space to explore storytelling, something I feel very passionately about. And how you effectively send a message that a brand feels very passionately about to an audience. So it's a very interesting space when you're in a publisher's in a brand studio for a publisher, because the audience is kind of finite. You as a publisher would have this fixed audience that you know very deeply about. You know what they love, where they are, beyond just the numbers, beyond the demographics. What they love to read. So it's a very nice enclosed space for storytelling, because you can almost kind of predict the right stories to tell to make that audience react, to engage that audience. So if you
That's also because, one of the publishers you worked for was CNN,
yes.
Huge brand. The volume they put out,
yeah.
You've got a huge sample size, you've got a huge range of content, huge audience, so you get a lot of feedback. And I think maybe that's something that brands don't do as well at.
Yeah, and it's something that, we used to kind of talk about, knowing your audience. You've heard this before. You need to know your audience, you need to know what they're interested in, the data behind storytelling and all of that. I think, but more importantly, being a part of that organization like CNN, firstly, there was that appreciation for a good story that we always started out from. So, knowing the audience it's something we knew anyway. But more importantly, telling the story is what kind of puts you ahead of everyone else. Because knowing how to tell a good story, kind of what makes it a good story, what lies at the heart of a good story, that I think will make the product or the content a lot better.
I think that journalistic skill set is underrated in the brand world, and I think due to various reasons, there's a lot of journalists kind of floating around who I think could be potentially sort of sucked up by brands and made use of. Just before the cameras came on, and just before I get to my main questions, we talked about the difference between content and stories. And I liked your take on that. So I know we were off camera, but maybe you can give us the summary of that chat we had.
Over the past, 8-10 years, brands kind of realized that content is important. But I think it's gotten us to a point where we appreciate, content and the volume of content, or where it sits, how you execute it, whether it's on TikTok or Instagram or LinkedIn, more than what lies at the heart of content, which will, like I said, separate the quality of your product from the rest. So if you have an appreciation for storytelling, let's go down to the very basics, what we learned in school, what makes a good story, the protagonist, the antagonist, the denouement, and kind of structuring that and understanding how you apply that when you want to send a message out, I think is critical before you think about, I want to do content. Like, what is my story? And I think which is why I love this medium of storytelling, because it's such there's a human need for it, right? We all love stories. We all interact with stories in our own way. But therein lies that ability for you to not just understand your audience, but understand yourself as a brand. So I always think about, when we're thinking about a campaign that we want to do, the very basics that we as a team in Visa would think about is, well, what's the bigger story here? What is the perspective that our audience have? Do we know what it is? Or do we have to do a little bit of digging around to find out? And that, at the same time as you're doing that, it crystallizes who you are and why you're doing this work that you do as a brand. And it helps you to, refine. It's such an interactive process. You have that narrative for why you do it. You understand what you're trying to work towards, what you're doing for that end consumer. And it's iterative, right? You go back and you refine your product. You refine the way you tell that story. And of course, underneath all of it is, for a brand, it has to be authentic. So I love that process. I love the process of understanding, looking within yourself and saying, is this why you're doing this? What's the story you want to tell here? Are we being true to ourselves, So I think that is storytelling. That for me is what will put you ahead of anyone else when you try to tell a story about your brand beyond just, I need, what do we say, 10 videos.
Yeah, well, that's the problem with content, is it becomes very commoditized.
Very commoditized.
And I think sometimes we, instead of going from sort of story out, we tend to go from technology in. We tend to go, I want TikTok videos, and then we reverse engineer a story to fit into them. And I'm not, is it right, is it wrong? I don't know, but I just feel like it's the obsession our industry has with technology sometimes overrides the need for a good story to ground it.
I understand that. I understand where it's coming from, because I think as brands, you are constantly bombarded by, questions like, who are you? People ask these questions now in marketing departments, in comms departments. Who are we talking to? Where are they consuming this content? So that becomes such a big part of that conversation when it comes to, this idea of running a campaign. So you get sucked in by, TikTok and Instagram, and each of these platforms have a very different way of telling your story and who you're reaching out to. So it's very easy to get sucked in. And I don't think that it's something you can ignore. At some point in time in your journey, you have to kind of face the fact that that story has to fit on that platform. I get where this is coming from, but I think we always, as storytellers or as people who appreciate the art of storytelling, it's always good to kind of pull them back and say, hang on a minute, what do we want to say really?
Yeah, do we have a reason to sort of fill this space on this platform?
Yeah.
One of the things you said just now about you're constantly being asked about the audience and you have data and research, but actually one of the things you said and used a verb I love, which is digging for stories, and in the process of doing that, you discover things about yourself as a brand. The way, if you speak to novelists, they'll talk about how they discover the characters by writing them. And I think a lot of our knowledge, we value graphs and charts and Google Analytics very highly. And I think we've, to some extent, I could be wrong, maybe there are other companies doing this, but I think we've devalued qualitative data because we have so much quantitative data. We have so many data points and charts and graphs, and they're hugely credible. When you put a graph up, you're a very credible person. But actually, the focus groups and talking to people is another way, and I think storytelling gives you a legitimate reason to go out and talk to people and dig and find out what they think in a qualitative sense. You agree?
Yes, of course. When you're part of an organization like Visa, we, put stats out, numbers out. It's second nature to us. Numbers is like our business. And it's very easy to kind of get on that train and forget that actually the people behind these numbers, or what we like to call the story behind these numbers, is what's more important. Because you can sit in a meeting and pull out a PowerPoint with, the best numbers to justify an investment in your business. But if you're not the person that you're talking to is looking at the numbers, and he's looking at numbers and he's thinking about the next company that's pitching to him, who's probably got 2 points ahead of you. Numbers aren't as persuasive as a good story that hits his emotions. So that, I think, and it's not easy to find what that story behind that number is, and to find a way to tell it convincingly, especially when you think about, in the business audience that you're reaching out to. So it's a muscle, I feel, that you have to constantly work at to find that story behind that number and tell it in a way that's convincing for whatever end you want.
But I think you need all those elements. So I do a lot of presentation training, and one of the things I say is stats give you credibility.
Yes.
Stories give you memorability.
Yes.
And anecdotes give you relatability. So basically, you might have an amazing stat. Tell me a story that illustrates. So you might have a stat about 1 million people, but tell me the story of one. And then if you want to really hammer it home and close the gap between that abstract number and the person sitting in front of you, is give me an anecdote about how you met that person.
Yeah.
So 1 million people think this guy did this, and when I spoke to him, he told me this. Suddenly you've closed that gap between abstract and personal and relatable. So I think you need all those, but if you've just got numbers alone, and like you said, it's hard to find the story behind the number, and I think that's why a lot of people don't do that. But that's how you make it memorable and relatable and personal, and you evoke feelings and all that. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my agenda now, because we could go off in all sorts of directions. Visa, huge payments network, we've all heard of them, massive brand. Why does Visa need storytelling? Why do they need you to do what you do?
Because the business is changing. I mean, Visa because you're familiar with using the card, and you see the logo on the card. But, when we talk about protagonists, antagonists, the antagonists who are coming in are like your Apple Pays and your wallets. When you use these payment methods, the brand doesn't come out for you. So, when you use your Apple Pay, you're just tapping, you're not kind of cognizant of.
Yeah, my cards are all loaded into my Google. I got Android, Google Pay,
And you don't really kind of see the card, you don't feel it. Remember those ads in the 80s where you've got somebody who kind of takes out his Visa card, and there's such pride when he does it.
And the hero shot of it comes into shot.
Yeah.
The logo's just angled perfectly to the camera.
I don't have that anymore with Apple Pay. Like, I'm whipping out my phone at the train station and tapping it. It's my phone that's making that payment. So the brand needs to, there are a lot of things that are changing in our world, in the payments world, that, we see it as a challenge to us kind of continuing in this model. So stories are important because our business is also changing as a response to these challenges. And we need to be able to tell that story to a very new audience that's coming. We've got the younger Gen Zs who are coming in, who, for some have no idea what a credit card is, how a credit card works. There are entire generations of people coming in not realizing that before this, payments weren't digital. There's such a thing as cash, Yeah. So that business.
And I remember the machine where they put your card in.
You put your card in, and then you
get a little carbon copy stub and all that.
That entire generations of people who don't know about that. So the business is changing. The good thing is, because everything is digital, that's great for our business. But with this new environment and this new world, you kind of need to tell new stories, because when you make a payment now, there's a whole virtual world that you don't see that pushes the payment, the network kind of working, and what are the things that affect that payment. So there's risk, fraud. Who are the people working in between, your money from the merchant to the issuer, these are the terms we use internally, but basically from your bank to your merchant, the shop's bank, there are a lot of things in between those two that's at work. And making people realize that, we are in this business is important to keep our brand out there. And we're a very B2B business. So, like I said, you wouldn't know Visa is behind you going to McDonald's and paying for your meal. But we're the ones moving your money, and we need you to remember that. So we need to tell that story and talk about what we're doing in this new world. And then, there's a whole host of new areas where payments kind of changing the way you live even. So if you think about, the future city, for example, what does that look like? How payments kind of make it easier for you to get from point A to point B, because public transports now use the technology that we
One of my new favorite things is that whatever country in the world I go to, more and more, I don't need to work out their local transit system and is it a card or is it
whether you buy
oyster
an oyster or an octopus or whatever it is.
Card works everywhere.
It works everywhere. So that's changing our lives. It's so important to tell these stories because we're at the heart of it. The way you live your life now is a lot more efficient because of certain things that we can do for you. So I think that's the reason why we have this role in Visa, or the team that I have in Visa. It's because the organization realized that, we need to be telling these stories and to keep the brand kind of alive in the minds of people who may not.
And I think there's a lesson for sort of older or legacy brands there, which is to say, if you're innovating and your business is changing, that's great, but let people know that, because it's easy to sort of fade into memory of my dad used to have one of those in the 80s type thing. Show people that you are changing with the times.
Exactly, and if you're innovating and changing means there's a perspective that you have about what the future looks like. And I think that is a very interesting story to tell, because everybody's kind of on this ship or this journey where, things are constantly changing. If you can help steer that audience, that's building a relationship with that audience, that's creating advocacy for the brand, and if you are, we know this, if you are a brand that's, empowering your audience with knowledge, with information, makes it easier for you as a brand to come up with, a product that works, that will be popular with that audience. But I think at the heart of it is you have to know that iterative process of understanding that audience, what they're facing with this change, what's your perspective on it, what's their perspective, how do we kind of meet in the middle and tell that story. So I think it's so important for a brand that's changing, that realizes that the world that they're going into can be shaped by what they're doing, and for them to tell that story at the same time.
Well, it can help them explain sort of complex changes and the reason behind the changes without it just being, announcements that sort of lack context. I think in business, we're all supposed to be very pro-innovation and change and be unafraid of change and unafraid of failure. But actually, most people quite naturally and quite reasonably are afraid of change, or they're not necessarily ready to click their fingers and do it overnight. So I think the process of explaining to people, why are things changing? Why is that good for you? How can we help you through it? That's an acknowledgement that, your customer's perspective might be different from yours. You might be the chief technology officer and you love change, but my mum who uses visas every day, perhaps she needs a little time. And a little help to get used to that.
Exactly. My mom still thinks about, is it safe for me to put my card on my phone?
My wife got a new iPhone yesterday, and I said, "You want me to put your card on your phone?" No.
Yeah, no.
My wife.
Yeah. So
She's Gen X.
Wow.
She's a little older than me. So then give me an example of this. So what kinds of stories are you telling at the moment?
So at the moment, a lot of it is around, like I said, what is that, for example, the metaphor of the future city, what that looks like. And the kind of stories we want to tell is, what do you need to do to kind of equip yourself in order to be, efficient, in order to be, for example, if you're a government decision maker, what are you doing in order to make your citizens kind of prosper? But I think the stories that I really love right now is how we kind of bring people into the economic system. So people who are unbanked, people who usually wouldn't have access to the financial system, for example, whether they live in the villages, how do we connect them, whether it's via making public transport more accessible, or whether it's, providing them a virtual card or whatever. How do we help you as an individual be a part of, an economic system that's very digital, that's very different right now, and how that kind of changes your life. So we've got a lot of stories that we tell in, kind of helping women entrepreneurs, for example, and what that means for their community, helping small businesses and what that means for the community around that small business. So I love those stories.
That's nice. That's warm, fuzzy storytelling.
Fuzzy, it's always the human element in it. And, small businesses are fascinating. The kind of,
people make money doing
yes.
odd stuff.
I love
there are
it.
some weird jobs out there.
Yes, there are. And it's also fascinating when you're trying to look at a small business that's trying to reach beyond their borders. That one for me is interesting because, we found a Japanese merchant selling Japanese craft. And the interesting thing is he's found a niche market for it, in Scandinavia somewhere.
Obviously, why not?
And, that's how he's, growing his business. Or a lady who's taken time off from work decided to make soap and has prospered in that area. So I love small business stories. There's always of course, there's lots of human, the human element is so strong in these small business stories.
I think small business stories can be full of heart in a way.
Yeah.
Great big corporate stories maybe aren't. I remember years ago, I was working with a brand who will remain unnamed, and they wanted to tell this case study, but it was with a huge airline, and they were determined we're not going to do anything until when we get this case study, when we finally get their legal and their PR on board, it's going to be amazing because the numbers are huge and it's a big project, blah blah blah. And they waited and waited and waited, and the legal and PR could never sort it out. And in the meantime, their competitor had told lots of little small business stories. And although the numbers weren't as impressive and the scale wasn't impressive, but the characters were more interesting. They were more relatable, they were more quirky and different. And the brand that I'd been talking to has sort of left the market open for 2 years, waiting for this one golden case study to happen, and it never did. I was like, what a waste of time that was. It seems like a real shame.
Yeah.
It's interesting also you mentioned the sort of unbanked there. I was caught up in maybe a little conspiracy about the cashless society and how, it was the elite, the Illuminati are trying to take over and take our cash from us. And actually it was someone from Visa, this was many years ago now.
Yeah.
It was actually someone from Visa. I used to do a little bit of work with them years ago. And he explained to me that in developing countries, cash spreads disease. It's very dirty. Cash is highly corruptible because you can't trace it and track it. Cash is highly stealable. People have nowhere to put their cash, and so it's very vulnerable to them. And by the end of this conversation, this story he told me, I was absolutely convinced in a way that I'd never been before. Despite people, perhaps the story about efficiency and all this hadn't connected with me, but that story, which just shows you don't always know which story is going to connect and you need to tell multiple, but that had never occurred to me, and I thought, wow, that's a perspective.
We did a story like that last year. This was around Eid in Bangladesh, not Eid al-Fitr, Eid with the other Eid. So, Muslims celebrate 2 Eids. So part of this is the trading of cattle. Because part of the celebration is, you would buy a cow and slaughter it and share it with the people who are less fortunate than you. So a lot of families would get involved in the buying of, cows.
Okay.
In Bangladesh, the cow farmers would come every Eid, maybe about a week before the celebration, bring the herds with them into these cattle hearts, they call it HAATS, and they would trade. That's where they trade. You would go there as an individual and say, okay, I want to buy a cow for my family. That's a massive animal to be buying.
It's a big commitment, yeah.
So it also involves a lot of cash. The entire operation was cash-based. So you can imagine the amount of cash that was passing through. We're talking about millions of dollars here. And the danger was these farmers would be traveling on foot or by their lorries to the city to sell and bringing back that cash. So it's not safe. Looking a whole lot of cash, they can be robbed. Yep. It also didn't give the government an idea of what was kind of transacting between these farmers and people who buy these cows. So, that's not a transparent economic system.
Water there.
So the good thing was we had, the government engagement side of Visa, thought, we can actually help these guys out, because if we try, giving them, each of these farmers, like a bank account, set them up really quickly, each one be given a card, and let's try and see if we digitize this system. And it was fantastic. The stories that we got out of there was, we interviewed the farmers, we interviewed the dairy association head, we interviewed the people who were going to buy these, these cows. And these are interesting stories, because remember, these are people whose aim is to give to the poor. It's a celebration, it's a religious celebration that is very, very important to them. So they appreciated it even more. And that was a good story, because to them it's like, it's so easy now. I don't have to bring this wad of cash with me. Then for the farmers, it was like, I feel so much safer now that I can go back and know that, everything that I've sold, I can bring back with me. The stories were fascinating, but that's exactly that story that you were talking about, where cash, there's a lot of problems with cash. If you can digitize it, you help a lot of people, and that's a lot of good that you can actually do. So we got that story. I think there's a film that we did out of it, so that I really love.
So my next question then, I love that. That's brilliant. That feels like proper journalism to me as well. You're sitting in your very nice, I've been to your office, your very nice air-conditioned office in Robinson Road in Singapore, very lovely, built and wealthy Singapore. How are you going about finding these stories? Because I think this is a problem. A lot of marketers, communicators, they're sitting in HQ. Their days are dominated by what's coming from on top. The CEO's got an appearance here, or we've got an investor relations thing there, or whatever. They've got to deal with that. These things take time to find. They're not necessarily immediately in front of you. So what's the process that you or Visa goes through to find these great stories?
We're very lucky, because at least where I kind of work in Asia Pacific, we've got market teams everywhere. And we've got a comms team and a marketing team in every single country that we operate in Asia Pacific. So they are our legs, essentially. And they are the ones with the stories, because the business is done in the markets. So for this story, it was our Bangladesh team that kind of surfaced it. They were the ones who, we had a conversation and said, okay, let's interview somebody. Look, I want real stories. I want somebody who's really going to go there and buy a cow. And I want a real farmer who's really invested in this, and he signed up to the program. Tell me why he signed up for it. Do you know anything about him? Tell me everything you know about. So this was our Bangladesh government engagement kind of business person. But he understood, I think, he understood the importance of telling these stories, and he found us the best characters for these stories. There was an appreciation for someone with a real authentic kind of need to be a part of that system, and he found them. And he was like, yeah, you should come and film the cattle hut. Literally, it is like a shed with a bunch of cows and herds of it. So he even understood the visuals that would make the story stand out. So giving us access to these places. So I love that.
That's actually very important. I remember again one of my little anecdotes where just you hold your head in your hands and you'll understand this completely. I was talking to the CTO of some big company, and he said he told me a story about how when the Fukushima disaster happened, they literally sent frogmen under the water to sort of kind of duct tape up the cables to try and get some sort of signal through so they could find people. And he said, and when we found people under the rubble and all of their signals from their phones, he said, you think it's a good story? I said, it's a freaking great story. And he said, well, how would we tell it? And I was like, well, we'll try and call up CNN, we'll get some footage of the disaster, we'll get some before and after, we find the frogmen, all this. And he said to me, or what I was thinking was, you could come and interview my CEO about it. Yeah. It was like a talking head in an office sort of going, as a provider of solutions, we're proud to go above and beyond for our customers. Like, oh my God, you just killed the story. He had no understanding of the visuals and the drama and all that kind of stuff. So your guys in market, if they've got their eyes out for these stories, are they trained or incentivized, or how do they know you're looking for stories?
It's a conversation. It's many phone calls, many video calls. This is not their day job, so-called. They have other responsibilities. So I think it's about kind of constantly telling the teams that we have in the markets that, hey, this is a cool story that we've done for this market. And, getting them familiar with why it's a cool story, why it's a good story. Let me know if you've got something. It's a constant conversation that I'm having with the market teams, sending them examples of work that we've done that we would love to do more of, and then slowly.
It's like you're the editor and you've got your correspondents in the field.
But they don't realize that it actually.
They don't realize that that's how you're putting them to work.
So it's like we really want to tell the story because it's important for your market. I think they need to be invested in it because they know that for the business that they're doing, we're lucky in that they realize these stories actually do them good.
But that's a good point because often very often where I've sort of found a story for a client, said we should talk to them, said, well, we have to go through the account team, and then the account team goes, no, I'm not talking to them unless, I'm not going to ask them to do so. There's a lot of roadblocks to telling the story. So how do you face those, and how do you get over
Of course, we face tons of those. Sometimes, you go to an accounts team and they send you out to a client's accounts team. So, and then it's radio silence for a week. So for us, it's kind of going around, maybe talking to our marketing guys and say, hey, you don't work with this bank. Do you think somebody at the bank has a story about this? And then they're like, yeah, actually, we do have it. It's about kind of working all the different angles that we have. So I am one person who's like, I don't really care about protocols when it comes to kind of searching for that story.
That's fairly wise.
It's the worst thing you can ever do, I think, in my line of work is to wait for something to come down the proper channels for the story to appear, because then you're a year out and you've got a bunch of money that you need to spend, and then you're telling really ridiculous stuff. So, we look for the stories. We exhaust all avenues, let's say that.
And if something comes out of the woodwork, if you hear something, you go, oh, that's amazing. Yes. Do you have the capacity to jump on that?
We did the Bangladesh story that was my first week at work in Visa.
Wow.
And we turned it around. And don't forget, it's Eid, so there's a finite time for us to capture that footage.
You can't go back next Saturday and it's happening again.
Because after they buy all of that, the next time you have to catch that activity is a year out.
Yeah.
So you had to kind of get things sorted out really quickly. The partners that we work with, fantastic. C2V.
Click to View?
Yes.
Simon will be on here.
Yeah. Fantastic in kind of, okay, yes, we can do this. We have somebody on the ground here. We can activate really quickly. So we're quite lucky in that sense.
But I think what I love about that is I do think there's a huge value to be had in taking a journalistic approach. A lot of when you're a journalist, I trained as a journalist. I didn't practice very long. I jumped to the media sales side. But Simon from Click to View, who's been on the sofa and is an old friend and business partner of mine, he knows as a journalist that you've got to fill that paper every day. You've got to fill that TV station every single day. So you just got to make it happen. You've got to drive it. I think more brands could use that. There is so much chin stroking and consideration, and let's zoom out and let's whiteboard it and blah, blah, blah. And sometimes you go, actually, if you added up the real cost of all that procrastination and the amount, if you put the actual cost of everybody's hour spent in those meetings not doing the work, you could have just got it in the can. Yeah. And I would love more brands to think that way.
There's also value in, there's always that hesitance, like, is this really a good story to tell? Is it really important? I think every story that tells that exemplifies or that shows you how your brand is doing, doing good is enough. Even if it's a
how can
small
that be a
story.
bad thing, right?
Even if it's a small story, if you're telling like 10 small stories of helping 10 small businesses, that's so valuable instead of waiting for the right small business who's got all the features in place, checks all the boxes, we go back to that idea of content, how brands always want a lot of content. There is some value in it because the minute you put that content out there, there's a lot of learning you can get from that, and that's valuable, beyond anything. Looking at what stories kind of land for you as a brand, looking at what stories your audience engage with. You need that volume out there in order to get data that's reliable if you don't believe in anything else.
But I think the brand mindset carries over from the age of advertising, where you spend a year or two coming up with the 1 30-second spot. Yeah. It's like trying to write a guaranteed number one hit single. Even the Beatles couldn't do that. They had to write hundreds of songs to get those however many number ones they got. I think that is a fundamental thing that's got to change. This idea that we're gonna think about it, and then put all our eggs into that one basket. And how much can that tell you? I think a volume of stories and thinking like a publisher can be very, very valuable, because also we're all dealing with multiple constituents. There's no one ideal Visa customer. Yeah. So you don't know what's going to connect with who, where, and the only way you can tell is by putting stuff out there. Obviously, when I say obviously, the cow thing's a good story, but actually I'm sure there's plenty of people who wouldn't necessarily have spotted that story. So what do you think are the elements of a good story for you and for Visa?
It has to firstly be authentic. I love real stories, so you're not pulling somebody who's an actor speaking about, using a card or whatever. A compelling story, I think, is one that shows impact that your brand has had. And I think when we say impact, you think, I have to make a big splash in someone's life or whatever. But even if it's helping a family kind of pay for their daughter's school term or something, and how that, doing it in a timely manner, doing it fast because it helped. Any small story that has a human impact, I think, is what I look for. I know where I start from when it comes to telling that story. So, and it's even more important in a place like Visa because, like I say, it's a very B2B business. We're talking about, moving money across borders. We're talking about, remittance. How do we move money fast, safe, and efficiently? And you go into the technicality of that. Who are your partners who can make it happen? But actually, the story about remittance, that's a very human story at the heart of it. So,
well, who's sending money to who and for what purpose?
For what purpose?
That's endless stories.
Who are they helping? What is the future they're building? Is this what are they saving towards? If that's the case, that's a very human story. So to me, I think is what I prize over everything else. What is at the heart of it? What's the emotion? What's the human story behind this?
You're very clear on your themes.
Yeah.
You're looking for authentic, human, but also how does it convey a potential future?
Yes.
I don't mean many people are so clear on this. It's a bit like a newspaper knowing their news values. What is a story for our paper or our TV channel or our whatever, our studio? You're very clear on your themes. I think that's a takeaway for the audience to be really clear on your themes.
It is. It's something I see as integral for the team that I work with. So, we actually have this. What is the frame around the story? And that frame has to be consistent because it talks to who you are. It speaks about who you are as a brand and what you're working towards. Don't forget that there's always a bigger brand story that you're telling behind every single small story. That has to be constant. That has to be a unified message that you're going out. So I think having that as an anchor kind of helps us identify the stories that we want, but also at the end of it, knowing that you've got maybe like 20 stories that you've put out throughout the year and all kind of singing from the same hymn sheet, so-called.
Yeah, collectively they
deliver this
message, promise, whatever.
What's the impact of that? How are we creating longevity for the brand? in that space. So that's something I think we've identified as important from the start, and something we use every day when we think about the work that we do.
What is the, I've seen hints of the process of how you get a story from sort of concept to completion. So it might start with a call with a country team. You talked about you have some partners, Click2View is one, I'm sure there are others. You just sort of take me through the process right the way up to sort of publishing and distribution.
Yeah, so we sit within the communications team, so the PR team. And these guys, the PR team will know, this is an announcement that's coming up, or, you've got a business that's done a white paper. They love white papers.
You love white papers. I've done my white papers in my time.
Love white papers. Or research study, and that's the material that they come to us with. So the team kind of sits down and actually read through these white papers and research study and say, and we sit together and we're like, okay, what's the story here? If it's a study around how Gen Zs are paying for their bus rides, their taxi rides, what's the story here? Okay, they're cognizant of the change. They want efficiency. They want, ease. They don't want to think about changing out cards or whatever that story is. We sit down as a team. We look at the materials that we have, and kind of dig out that story and set it within the framework that that we have kind of in our minds. And then we go to the markets and think about, hey, is there a story you think we can tell? Because don't forget, the business is in the market, so we can't just base our stories, or we can't just depend on Singapore to kind of give us the stories.
Yeah, of course.
So it's going out to like Japan.
And Singapore is not typical of the region. I always find telling stories here have limited resonance because it's such a unique environment.
Yeah, so many different countries in the region kind of have different experiences of digital payments, for example, right? So we go out to the markets, think about, hey, do you guys have a story around this young person who started a business and how he's been helped in this way? And they come back to us, or we go to our partners like C2B. They do a little bit of story research for us, because they've got producers everywhere, which I love.
Yes, they do.
And they come back to us, and then it's about us kind of sitting at the table and say, okay, let's have a look at this, do a little bit of research, Google search for this business or whatever, and kind of get our partners rolling. Okay, we want to tell this story. We want our writers to interview this person to write it, whatever that is, and the production kind of continues, and then the end process of that is going to the marketing guys and say, hey, we've got this piece of work. Do you want to,
Share it
amplify
with the
it
world,
for us?
make it a thing.
Pay some money
Of
to
course.
amplify it. But yeah, and the publishing process, we publish it on on blogs or on LinkedIn or whatever. But there's always that learning that we want to do after that. So one of the things I said to the team is we never create content that nobody reads, nobody watches. And it's easy to kind of fall into that when you're just thinking about, okay, I want to do 4 films this year, but you're not thinking about who's watching it. Are you making sure they're watching it? Are you putting some money behind the amplification? Because no, let's be real, that needs to happen. People need to be watching your stories. And are you doing the right thing to make sure that you're reaching that right audience? That
You sometimes get that commission where it's like they're almost ordering content by the pound. Do you know what I mean? It's like I remember I got a call once, I want 20 Facebook videos. I said, all right, I've only got 3 questions for you. Why 20? Why Facebook and why videos? And they didn't have an answer. It was just someone had said that's what we need. But
that was my life in CNN.
Well, we've all been there. I've been there.
We've all been there. So I think, it's an easy kind of thing to default to, especially if you're a business person, you're answering to your KPIs or whatever, to think about it that way. But
Visa, I mean, as you said, so I know Click2View. I was part of Click2View many years ago. And I was there in the early days when Visa was a client of theirs. And one of the smartest decisions I thought that was made there was, I remember they came to us and they were the first client who'd said that they wanted us to tell some stories for them, but didn't tell us how many blogs, how many videos. They said, we have a budget. How do you think we should tell this story? What's the best way to tell this story? Is this a video story? Is this a presentation story? Is it a blog story? I still haven't really come across anyone else who's done it that way.
Yeah, I think it's the culture that we have in Visa that I really appreciate, where we are given, we're given the ability to try things and fail. And I love that, especially in storytelling, especially in this space. Try things and fail, and if it fails, learn from it and move on. You think about an organization and you know how they say we've got a culture that encourages that. Visa really kind of walks the talk when it comes to these things. So,
well, I've been lucky enough to have the tour around the sort of innovation lab you have actually in the office. So the sorts of people who do fail for a living are actually in the office, and so I think that probably creates a culture where actual innovation's allowed to happen, as opposed to the value of innovation being painted on the reception wall, which you see in a lot of companies. But
and especially in Asia Pacific, I think for Visa, somehow this idea of trying things out, because we realize that it's different. The condition in Japan or Korea is very different from what you would get in Vietnam and Cambodia. So there's a lot of learning from each other, understanding you're all operating in very different kind of environments. How do we kind of, there's no unified strategy that can work for everyone. So that idea of always trying things out and seeing what sticks where you are is something everybody in the organization believes in. And in my space, it's fantastic.
With content, I like the idea that the themes can be universal. There's themes of humanity, emotion, future, but the executions can be more localized.
Yes,
I think that's a good framework, or one of the good frameworks to try. So you've made your beautiful content, you've gone to marketing, they've dug out your budget, and they're putting it out in the world. How do you measure success? What are the things you look at to know if something's worked?
This is the hard one. So with content, back when I was at CNN, it was always about, they kind of sold ads. They were in the business of, they are in the business of selling ads.
Yeah, still are, yeah.
So impressions, how many ads do you get, on TV?
Yeah, click-throughs.
Yeah, click-throughs and all of that. And that became the language when it came about talking about content. But I think over the years at CNN, we've implemented, you need to look at engagement, how much people are watching, how much people are reading. We did a lot of these microsites for brands. I did a lot of microsites for brands, and implementing the technology behind these sites to make sure we're measuring that's 25, 50, 75% of that content. So engagement was very important. But I think more important than that, it's trying to convince the client that this is what you're looking at. You're not looking at volume. You're looking at how deep or how much of the content reached your audience. And then it's the same with Visa. So now it's, I think we're all kind of beholden to the platforms that we use in terms of measuring content in a way.
You can only measure what they let us measure,
what they let
and in the terms they do. Yeah.
And they're the ones who set the benchmark, like a view is 30 seconds. Like,
or three, wasn't Facebook got in trouble because it was a 3 seconds?
3 seconds,
was a view.
yes, for a while. And we're all beholden to that. I kind of want to think about new ways of doing this, and I hope there are people out there who can teach me a way to kind of circumvent, how this conversation around how effective content is. The other thing is, a lot of business people think about ROIs. They love this. If I'm spending $20,000 on a film, how much does that translate into sales? That is not something you should ever do with content. I remember reading this comic of a dog reading a newspaper, and he puts it down and he says, "I'm going to buy a boat now." That's not how content works. You don't watch it and then suddenly get, moved to buy the product that was alluded to in that content. So I think it's about convincing people that, look, content is a long game. We talk about having 20 videos, kind of selling that one message in different ways, in different markets, and then measuring it after a year. That, I think, is the kind of thinking that I hope to kind of,
One of the things I would like to see more of is the, rather than measuring each asset on its own merit, it's when you combine them. So for example, a client that I have, we made a bunch of films for them, but we also work on their CRM program. And so what's happened is the films now go into the CRM emails, which makes them more interesting, and they're more linked to a direct sales channel.
Yeah.
So what we found is because we're putting more interesting content into the emails are getting higher open rates and higher click-throughs than they were without that content in it. And that leads to a measurable revenue outcome. But that's kind of if you measured the videos on their own or the emails on their own, it wouldn't make sense. But you put the two together and suddenly you're starting to see an impact.
Yeah. So as a content team, we can't just be creating content and expecting to only measure how that content works on the published platforms that we have. So one of the things we found was, let's try this. Let's put, a snippet of this content on an internal memo that went out to the entire organization. But we found there was one story where a sales team saw the memo, took it, sent it out on their own newsletters to their clients that we would never have known existed, because it's something they do within their own department. And they said, actually after a while they came back to us and said, we love these memos that you send out because it has all these interesting nuggets that we use and we send out to our clients. And
I wonder how many of those hidden channels exist in organizations. You're like dark socials, like dark channels in companies.
That is more valuable than any kind of click-through rate in my mind, because content then has use and you've got somebody coming back telling you it's something I depended on for an entire quarter when I was doing these newsletters for my clients. I mean, that's a fantastic story.
I think one of the most basic things you can do is arming your sales team with really good content and sales stories. I mean, that's a, and again, but they kind of operate separately sometimes. So the content goes out over here and the sales guys have no idea, and we need to join everything up a bit better, I think.
Yep.
So the last story, the last question I'm going to ask you is I ask everybody, and you can answer personally or professionally. But what's the one story you've always wanted to tell? Is there a novel burning inside you, or a film you want to make, or a customer that you just haven't gotten to make a film about yet?
Oh my God, that's a good question. I know you sent me these questions before to kind of prep me, but I didn't think about this. I mean, personal stories, of course, there are personal stories. I think, personally, I think stories about, the diverse culture we have in Singapore is not told enough. There are small communities that, that have fascinating stories, fascinating cultural practices that aren't told enough. For example, the Orang Lauts, for example, in Singapore, who they were.
I'm feeling very lost.
I mean, it is part of a peninsula. We are part of this Malay peninsula. They call it the Nusantara. So the Orang Lauts were the people who were, fishermen, people who lived in the islands around Singapore.
Got it.
They have an interesting history, interesting culinary history. Oh, I love stories about food, by the way, personally.
Of course you do. Of course you do.
So,
Singapore.
How food kind of evolves, etc. So I think that is fascinating. There is a group that's kind of trying to tell that and making the food around it. I think I love it. But I think the stories that I want to tell, that I think coming from Visa, where everything is very corporate and,
of course, big multinational company, they got rules.
But if you are really brave enough as a corporate and tell the real authentic stories, I feel it can do so much more for your brand. If every brand wants to talk about diversity and inclusion or enforcing a good work culture. If you can tell the real stories about how you enforce that within your organization, how you make sure that, you get rid of, work environments that don't serve, your employees better, that's great. And I think brands are not brave enough to do it. In these spaces where you're talking about enforcing or I think the word is inculcating a better work culture, a better work environment, it's born out of, at least where I come from, I think it's born out of looking at what's going on in the office and making the changes that you think will be good for the organization. We do that a lot at Visa, but we don't tell that story on an external platform.
I think when it comes to things like sustainability, DE&I, we're still at the stage where it's announcements.
Yeah.
We've implemented this policy, we've hired this consultant. I think we need to start moving towards the proof points, and the proof points are the stories.
Yes. And if you're an organization that really kind of takes that seriously, you would have the best stories to tell. You would have great stories to tell because you would have made the changes.
Well, maybe that's the fear, is a lot of organizations are making announcements, but maybe not implementing to the degree that we'd like to see.
Yeah, I think so. But, you know, that's what I mean. One of the things I really like about storytelling, or one of the things I think is important about storytelling, is being authentic, right? So if you're going to go out there with one big ESG campaign around how you're planting trees for every item that someone's bought, then let's look at it a few years down the road and let's tell that story. So that's me.
I think, I don't have anyone specifically coming on to talk about sustainability. I can think of a few people who'd be very, very good at that, but I think the planting trees thing has become a cliche. You know, the CEO putting the shovel in the ground. There are so many other things to be done, and I don't mean going paperless. I mean there are technologies, there are projects and investments and divestments you can make that make your company very sustainable. We don't have time for that now.
Nope.
Thank you very, very much for sharing with us. You've been very candid, and I think there's a lot of good takeaways there. Thank you so much for watching, or indeed listening to The Business of Storytelling. If it's your first time, please like, subscribe, comment, share, argue, pick a fight with me. I don't mind. I can take it. I'm big enough and ugly enough. I've got to thank my general sponsor, Vimeo. They are the platform with everything you need to make, manage, and share brilliant videos at vimeo.com. How? Just go to vimeo.com, work it out there. Otherwise, we will see you again with another episode, and hopefully you'll find us floating around all over social, putting all into practice the wonderful things that we were told today by Nadia. See you next time.